At 3:44 a.m., Camp As Sayliyah on the western outskirts of Doha sat in the Qatari desert in the final hour before the pre-dawn call to prayer, its operations centers running at the sustained tempo that the most consequential American military headquarters in the region maintained without pause through every hour of every day of the conflict. The camp housed the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, the combatant command whose area of responsibility covered 21 countries across the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, and from whose hardened operations, complex every American military operation in the region was ultimately coordinated. Carrier strike group deployments, air campaign targeting cycles, logistics chains, intelligence collection priorities, rules of engagement updates, the diplomatic communications that ran alongside the military operations, all of it flowed through the command architecture that lived inside the Camp As Sayliyah compound. It was not simply a military headquarters. It was the organizational brain of the most complex sustained military campaign the United States had conducted since the Second World War. The IRGC had understood from the first day of the conflict that destroying or severely disrupting Camp As Sayliyah would produce strategic effects that no other single military action available to them could match. Not the carriers were mobile, their positions unpredictable over any 24-hour period, and their destruction would not disrupt the command architecture that directed the campaign. Not the air bases. The air campaign's command and control was distributed enough that the loss of any single airbase would reduce capacity without eliminating direction. The CENTCOM forward headquarters was different. It was fixed. It was identifiable. It was the one node whose disruption would force the most consequential reconstitution challenge, not because CENTCOM lacked backup command facilities, but because the reconstitution would require time. And time during a sustained combat campaign has costs that compound. Every hour of degraded command coherence was an hour in which the 60-plus sorties that CENTCOM coordinated daily across the theater were flying without the integration that made them effective against defended targets. The targeting problem had dominated the IRGC's planning staff since day 3. Camp As Sayliyah was in Qatar. Qatar had been, from the conflict's outset, in the specific political position of a state that hosted American military forces while simultaneously attempting to maintain the diplomatic relationships with Iran that its geographic position and energy economics required. Qatar had not participated in combat operations. Qatar had not provided forward basing for strike missions. The Qatari government had communicated privately to Washington its understanding of the operational necessity of the CENTCOM presence while publicly maintaining a posture of encouraging negotiation. The IRGC's targeting analysis had concluded that striking Camp As Sayliyah would damage Qatar's ability to maintain this careful position, potentially driving Doha toward a more overtly adversarial relationship with Iran that would complicate the IRGC's diplomatic options. The cost of attacking Qatar in the IRGC's strategic calculation was real but acceptable if the military effect justified it. After 4 weeks of a conflict that was systematically eliminating Iranian military capability, the IRGC's strategic command had determined that the military effect justified it. The weapons package for the Camp As Sayliyah strike was the most ambitious the IRGC had assembled. 26 Sajil-2 medium-range solid-fuel ballistic missiles from hardened silos in the Alborz mountain foothills, the IRGC's longest range and most accurate ballistic weapon, solid-fueled for minimal pre-launch signature, with maneuvering re-entry vehicles that represented the most capable terminal guidance in the Iranian arsenal. 16 Emad liquid-fueled intermediate-range ballistic missiles from the Sharud complex, their longer range and heavier warheads compensating for their lower accuracy by targeting the compound's larger infrastructure. The fuel storage, the vehicle parks, the administrative buildings that surrounded the hardened operations center. and in the element that had been the most difficult to develop and that the IRGC's planners had spent the most time protecting from American collection, 12 modified Shahed 238 jet-propelled kamikaze drones with shaped charge warheads specifically sized and fused for penetration of hardened reinforced concrete structures. Drones that had been modified by Iranian engineers with guidance packages that combined GPS terminal guidance with a small radar altimeter that would allow them to strike specific vertical faces of hardened buildings rather than impacting on roofs where the overhead protection was heaviest. 54 weapons. The Sajil 2 and Emad missiles would arrive in the terminal phase simultaneously, saturating the Patriot and THAAD batteries covering the Doha area with a volume of maneuvering ballistic warheads above what the defense architecture's projected capacity could address with confidence. The Shahed 238 penetrators would arrive 90 seconds later, while the defensive systems were in their post-engagement reconstitution cycle, targeting the specific building facades where the hardened operations center's access corridors and ventilation penetrations were located. The plan was the most technically demanding the IRGC had ever attempted. It was also the plan that had been in the most intensive development for the longest time, 18 months from before the conflict began, because the IRGC's strategic command had recognized from the beginning of the conflict's planning phase that the ability to strike CENTCOM's forward headquarters was the decisive card in their strategic hand. The strike had been planned for 3:44 a.m. specifically, the hour when CENTCOM's night watch was at minimum staffing relative to day operations, when the watchstander fatigue factor was at its peak, when the reaction time from initial alert to protective posture completion was statistically longest. The IRGC's operational analysis of American military headquarters' protective posture protocols had produced this conclusion from the pattern of response times observed through surveillance of the compound during its routine operations over the preceding 16 months. At 3:44 a.m. and 6 seconds, 26 simultaneous Sajil 2 ignition events bloomed on the Space Force infrared picture of the Alborz foothills north of Tehran. 16 Emad ignition events followed at 3:44 a.m. and 22 seconds from the Shahrud complex. The Space Force warning reached Camp As Sayliyah at 3:44 a.m. and 38 seconds, 32 seconds after the first Sajil ignition. 32 seconds. The compound's protective posture protocol began at 3:44 a.m. and 41 seconds. This was 3 seconds faster than the IRGC's operational analysis had projected as the best-case response time. The discrepancy was not random. The watch officer on duty in the CENTCOM Operations Center at 3:44 a.m. had been on duty since midnight and had been maintaining a specific heightened monitoring posture since 1:17 a.m. when the Space Force fusion cell at Al Udeid had transmitted a preliminary alert, noting elevated communications activity on IRGC Aerospace Force Command frequencies consistent with pre-launch coordination. The preliminary alert had not identified the specific target or the specific timing. It had been sufficient for the watch officer to bring the compound to a modified readiness posture, not full alert, which would have been visible to the IRGC's surveillance of the compound and might have affected the launch timing, but a state in which the watch officer's hand was already moving toward the alert circuit when the Space Force warning arrived. 3 seconds faster. The time of flight from the Alborz complex to Qatar was 14 minutes and 22 seconds for the Sajil 2 on its programmed trajectory. From the Shahrud complex, the Emad's time of flight was 18 minutes and 40 seconds. The terminal phase arrivals were timed to be simultaneous. The first Sajil 2 warheads would reach the terminal engagement envelope in approximately 13 minutes from launch. The defensive architecture over Qatar had 13 minutes. The defensive architecture over Qatar had been substantially augmented in the 48 hours preceding the strike, augmented without any of the repositioning announcements or logistical signatures that would have alerted the IRGC's collection to a specific targeting of Qatar. The augmentation had been driven by the same preliminary signals that had generated the 1:17 a.m. watch officer alert, an assessment compiled over 3 days that the IRGC's command communications pattern was consistent with final preparation for a major strike on a coalition partner target. The assessment had rated Qatar as the most probable target based on the analysis of target priority, weapon selection implications from the launch complex activity, and the trajectory geometry suggested by the observable pre-positioning. A second THAAD battery, transferred from its reserve position at a classified Saudi location, had been moved to a Qatari deployment site under a cover operation disguised as a routine maintenance rotation. 4 additional Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries, the theater reserve that had been held at Al Udeid, specifically for augmentation of partner nation defenses at moments of assessed elevated threat, had been forward deployed to positions north and northeast of Doha at 11 p.m., 4 hours and 44 minutes before the Sejil launch. The augmentation had doubled the theater's interceptor capacity over Qatar. The IRGC's planning had been calculated against the pre-augmentation architecture. The THAAD batteries engaged the Sejil 2 cluster beginning at 3:52 a.m., 12 minutes after launch, as the missiles entered the exo-atmospheric mid-course phase at altitude. 2 THAAD batteries, their combined fire optimized through the Theater Missile Defense Common Operating Picture, addressed 20 of the 26 Sejil 2 missiles in the mid-course phase. 17 confirmed intercepts. 3 missed, their maneuvering re-entry vehicles having executed terminal guidance corrections at a rate that displaced them from the kill vehicle's computed intercept geometry by margins that the compressed mid-course engagement timeline could not fully compensate. 6 Sejil 2 missiles survived the THAAD mid-course layer. The 6 survivors and the 16 Emad missiles arriving in their own terminal phase were the problem the 4 augmented Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries had been positioned to address. 22 maneuvering ballistic warheads in simultaneous terminal descent, the number that the pre-augmentation defensive architecture's capacity analysis had rated as potentially exceeding reliable intercept confidence. With the augmentation, the capacity assessment had shifted to manageable with margin. The margin would matter. Shoot doctrine against all 22 threats. 44. PAC-3 MSE interceptors fired in a 98-second engagement window between 3:56 a.m. and 3:57 a.m. in 38 seconds. The engagement tempo was the most demanding any Patriot battery in the theater had experienced in the conflict. 2 battery commanders would later note in their post-engagement reports that the engagement control station processing load had reached 89% and 92% of rated capacity respectively during the peak of the engagement. The system had performed. 18 of the 22 surviving ballistic warheads were intercepted. 4 warheads survived the Patriot engagement. The first surviving Sejil 2 warhead impacted at 3:58 a.m. and 4 seconds on the camp's northern administrative sector, a complex of support buildings, dining facilities, and general-purpose offices that had been cleared of personnel by the protective posture protocol 4 seconds after the Space Force warning. The warhead detonated against the surface of the largest administrative building, collapsing the structure's upper 2 floors and scattering debris across a 300-meter radius. No personnel were in the building. The building was destroyed. The operations center 800 meters to the south received the pressure wave from the detonation as a measurable but non-structural force. The second surviving Sejil 2 impacted the Eastern Vehicle Park at 3:58 a.m. and 11 seconds, destroying 11 vehicles and damaging 23 others. The vehicle park had been cleared of personnel as part of the standard protective posture. The logistics vehicle fleet that supported the compound's daily operations was reduced, but not eliminated by the loss. The third surviving warhead, the first of 2 Emad missiles that penetrated the intercept layers, impacted the compound's communications antenna farm at 3:58 a.m. and 22 seconds. The antenna farm was the most consequential single impact of the strike. The hardened underground communications cables that connected the CENTCOM operations center to its external networks were undamaged. They ran below the antenna farm's surface infrastructure, in conduit that the blast could not reach. But 8 of the 22 antenna systems that provided the compound's satellite and line-of-sight communications were destroyed or severely damaged by the blast and fragmentation. The CENTCOM Operations Center shifted to its backup communications architecture at 3:58 a.m. and 26 seconds, 4 seconds after the antenna farm impact, the automated systems having detected the loss and activated the backup routing before the watch officer had completed her assessment of what had just happened. The backup architecture provided 63% of the primary communications capacity. 63% was sufficient to maintain command coordination across the theater at reduced bandwidth. No intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance product flow was interrupted for more than 40 seconds during the switchover. The 60 sorties currently airborne across the theater received no gap in communications with the CENTCOM Operations Center. The 4th surviving warhead impacted the compound's outer blast wall at 3:58 a.m. and 31 seconds on the northeast face. The blast wall performed as designed, absorbing the impact and preventing the blast wave from propagating into the compound's interior at damaging intensity. A section of the blast wall 40 meters wide was destroyed. The interior of the compound behind that section sustained blast overpressure effects that broke windows in the nearest building and displaced lightweight materials across a 60-meter area. The building that faced the breach in the blast wall was the Motor Transport Office, a single-story structure whose occupancy had been 0 since 3:44 a.m. and 41 seconds. The Shahed 238 penetrators arrived at 3:59 a.m. and 40 seconds, 99 seconds after the first Sejil impact. 12 jet-propelled drones with shaped charge penetrating warheads approaching on the flight profiles that had been programmed against the specific building facades of the hardened operations center. They arrived in the moment that the IRGC's planning had identified as the defensive reconstitution window, after the Patriot batteries had expended their engagement load against the ballistic layer and before the SHORAD systems could be fully organized against a new threat type. The SHORAD systems had been organized since 3:44 a.m. The compound's internal air defense, 4 Avenger systems, and 2 Centurion CRAM installations positioned at the compound's corners had been in active acquisition mode since the protective posture protocol activated. The Avenger teams had been briefed on the Shahed 238 as a secondary threat in every protective posture rehearsal for the past 3 weeks. When 12 Shahed 238 targets appeared on the Avenger operator's situational display at 3:59 a.m. and 37 seconds, the engagement was not a surprise. It was the second phase of an engagement sequence they had prepared for. 8 Shahed 238 were destroyed by Stinger missiles between 3:59 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 22 seconds. 2 were engaged by the Centurion CRAM guns at ranges under 800 meters. Both were destroyed. 2 Shahed 238s penetrated to within 400 meters of the hardened operations center building before being taken by the final Centurion system positioned at the operations center's immediate perimeter. Both destroyed at ranges of 340 and 290 meters respectively. 0 Shahed 238s impacted the operations center. At 4:01 a.m., the engagement was over. 4 ballistic warheads had impacted the compound. 0 drones had impacted the operations center. The CENTCOM forward headquarters was damaged in its administrative sector, its vehicle park, its antenna farm, and its blast wall. It was not disrupted in its command function. The operations center was running. The watch staff were at their stations. The communications architecture, reduced to 63% capacity through the backup routing, was managing the theater's 60-plus active sorties. CENTCOM was in command. The response was designated Operation Iron Crown. The Sejil 2 silos in the Alborz foothills had revealed themselves at 3:44 a.m. The Space Force constellation had tracked 26 solid fuel launches from positions whose precise coordinates had been uncertain. Solid fuel Sayliyah silos embedded in mountain terrain are among the most difficult targets in the Iranian targeting corpus, their small surface footprint and hardened construction making them resistant to characterization from overhead collection alone. The launches had provided the precise coordinates that the targeting analysis had spent the entire conflict trying to develop. The silos were now targets. 46 B-2A Spirit and F-35A aircraft dedicated to the Alborz target set, carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators and GBU-31 JDAM bombs, were already airborne on the transit profile that would bring them to weapons release range at 5:07 a.m. They had been airborne since 2:30 a.m., launched on the preliminary alert that had also generated the watch officer's heightened posture and the defensive augmentation of the Qatar architecture. The preliminary alert had done three things simultaneously: warned the compound, augmented the defense, and launched the response before the attack was executed. At 5:07 a.m., the Alborz strike package reached its release points. The GBU-57S assigned to the Sayliyah, two silos fell toward the mountain granite above the silo structures at 5:08 a.m. The seismic signatures registered on monitoring networks from Ankara to Islamabad. 14 separate seismic events between 2.2 and 3.1 magnitude clustered in the Alborz foothills, each corresponding to a GBU-57 detonating at depth in mountain rock above or inside a silo structure. The Shahrud Emad complex received its response simultaneously from the B-1B Lancer JASSMER salvo that had been released at 4:59 a.m. 24 JASSM-R missiles arrived at the Shahrud complex between 5:29 a.m. and 5:41 a.m. The liquid fuel infrastructure, the launch preparation buildings, and the command coordination complex were assessed as non-recoverable. At 5:52 a.m., the post-strike preliminary assessment reached the CENTCOM watch officer who had been on duty since midnight and who had maintained the heightened monitoring posture since 1:17 a.m. She read the assessment. She logged the damage to the compound, the administrative building, the vehicles, the antenna farm, the blast wall section, and she logged the operational status of the CENTCOM forward headquarters. Operational. Running at 63% communications capacity. Expected to restore to 91% within 18 hours as the backup systems were validated and the recoverable antenna systems were brought back online. The 60 sorties she was currently coordinating had not experienced a disruption. She logged the Iron Crown results, Alborz silos assessed as struck, Shahrud complex assessed as non-recoverable, and she updated the threat picture for the next watch cycle. At 6 a.m., she was relieved by the day watch officer. She briefed the incoming watch. Compound was damaged but operational. Communications at 63% with restoration in progress. Iron Crown assessment complete and in the system. Current sortie count 61. Weather in the operating areas clear. The incoming watch officer acknowledged. She left the operations center. The CENTCOM operations center continued running. It had not stopped. The IRGC had spent 18 months planning the strike that would disrupt the command architecture of the American campaign over Iran. They had executed it with 54 weapons, the largest single-target salvo of the conflict. They had achieved the destruction of an administrative building, 11 vehicles, 8 antenna systems, and a 40-meter section of blast wall. The command architecture they had targeted had not experienced a single minute of disrupted coordination. The 61 sorties that were flying when the first Sayliyah impacted were flying when the last assessment was logged. In the mathematics of command and control, the target that endures is the argument that prevails.